How's it going, everybody? So, after realizing that I was giving you guys misinformation about the thralls and the damage modifiers, I went back and I sat down and really dove in to the attribute system for the thralls. So, I looked at the damage modifiers and how those affected the different stats that the thralls get, and I've got it all figured out now, so I'm going to cover how all that works so that you can make the best decisions on what weapons to give your thralls after you level them up. So first and foremost, let me jump into this from ground level. All thralls have a melee and a ranged damage modifier. Now this modifier is not something that you can see in game unless you are in admin mode and you use the console commands to look those up. So if you want to look those up for yourself, you need to have the thrall following you, and then you're going to type in the console line get follower stat, damage modifier melee, or damage modifier ranged. Now, if you don't have access to the console commands or you don't want to do the work yourself, there are a couple ways to find this information on the internet. The first way would be simply to go to the wiki, look up the thrall that you want to know the stats on, and then look under the NPC stats. That will give you the melee and ranged damage modifier. And they do a pretty good job of keeping this up to date. There's another way that you can look it up, and I'll share the links in the description of this video, but Xavier has a couple of spreadsheets that has a ton of information about thralls in them. Just keep in mind that on that spreadsheet there is a disclaimer stating that some of that information may be incorrect. Now, the melee damage modifier affects any melee weapon, so it doesn't matter whether it's an agility weapon or a strength weapon, the melee damage modifier is affecting the damage that that weapon's doing. The ranged damage modifier is for your ranged weapons, so the bows, the throwing axes, the javelins, anything that would be considered ranged is going to be affected by that ranged damage modifier. So let's jump into the attributes that thralls have. You guys should know that they have strength, agility, vitality, and grit. So strength basically gives them more damage with strength-based weapons. It gives a little bit more damage to agility-based weapons, but we'll get into that here in a moment. So if you have a thrall that levels really well in strength, you want to make sure that you're giving them a strength weapon so that they get the best possible damage from their damage modifier. Now, if we look at agility, the agility attribute actually affects the agility-based weapons. So, if you have a thrall that levels high in agility, then you want to give them an agility-based weapon. Now, I did say that strength does affect agility, and also agility does affect strength. So as you are leveling both of those up, they are giving a slight bonus to their counterpart. So strength, when I was testing, gave about an 8% bonus to the agility weapon, where the agility, when I was testing that, gave about an 8% bonus to a strength weapon. But that 8% bonus only applied once I put 100 attribute points in strength and agility for that thrall. So whether you want to focus on leveling them up in agility or in strength, that's totally up to you and your style of gameplay and what gear you want to give them. Additionally, that would mean that if you have a thrall that you're giving a strength weapon and you want to boost their strength with armor, then you're going to want to give them a strength-based armor. And if you have a thrall that levels up in agility and you want to boost their agility damage, you want to give them an armor that boosts their agility damage. And the same thing would go for buffs. You want to line up your elixirs and your foods with whatever type of weapon you have given that thrall and where they've leveled the best. So I know you guys are going to ask, what about archers? How should you level them up if you're going to be using a bow? And the same rules apply to the bows that apply to melee weapons. So if the bow says it's an agility weapon, you want to level them up in agility. If the bow says it's a strength weapon, you want to level them up in strength. That's where they're going to get the best bonuses. One question that I've seen asked about bows and leveling them up in agility is if they get better accuracy when you level them up in agility, and I can't think of a good way to test this to see if they are more or less accurate with more agility points. However, I did notice during my testing that there seems to be a bug going on with the cripple shots. Every time my thrall took a cripple shot on an enemy, it only took 1 damage, where when it wasn't a cripple shot, it would take anywhere from 17 to 40 damage, depending on where I had the attributes placed for that thrall. And the same logic seems to go for bows that go for the melee weapons, where strength and agility are boosting each other. So if you have points in both, you're just getting more damage to that weapon. Now, there's another hidden stat that I've seen a lot of people talking about recently, and it has to do with the percent of damage gained when you level up strength or agility on your thrall. Now, I'm going to try to make this math as easy as possible and as easy to understand as I can, because there are different levels and tiers of this percentage for thralls. So for the lower level factions, they're actually going to gain 8% per 10 points leveled in strength or agility. And that's going to be Exiles tier 1 through 4, Lemurians tier 1 through 4, Relic Hunters tier 1 through 4, Votaries of Skelos tier 1 through 4, and then Heirs of the North tier 1 through 3. Now, the Heirs of the North tier 4 actually have a 5% increase for every 10 points gained. And then, as we get into the higher, more difficult tribes, they call a lot of these elites in the dev kit. So the Cimmerian Berserker or the Dalencia Snowhunter, for example, would be a Forgotten Tribe tier 4 elite, and they're only going to gain 4% per 10 points in strength or agility. And to make things even more complicated, I said earlier that the Votaries of Skelos tier 1 through 4 got the 8% per 10 points, but there's also votaries that are considered tier 4 elite that are only going to get the 4% per 10 points. Now, that information is listed on the spreadsheets that I told you guys I would link in the description of this video. So if you're really concerned with your thrall and what their gain is per point that they level up in strength or agility, you can check that out in that spreadsheet. However, I still think that stat is less important than the hidden melee or range damage modifier that your thrall has. You see, if you have a small melee damage modifier with a high percentage on top of that for damage, you still may not end up with the damage from a thrall that has a high melee damage modifier and a small percent boosting it. Now let's talk about the vitality stat. I think most of you probably already understand how this works, but basically every time you level in vitality, your thrall gains more hit points. And each thrall has a different amount of hit points that they'll gain per point in vitality. And when I do my top 10 thralls or my top 5 thralls videos, I always mention what the amount of hit points your thrall is going to gain per point in vitality. It's a very important stat for your thrall's survivability, and I actually recommend leveling in vitality over leveling in strength. You will still get some strength and agility bonuses just through leveling, but you really want to make sure that your thrall has enough hit points to be able to put the damage out that it needs to in order to survive. The last stat to talk about, and probably the one that's overlooked the most, is going to be grit. Now, when a thrall levels in grit, they actually gain armor that isn't linked to their equipment. And each thrall or faction is going to gain a different amount of armor per point in grit. Now, there really isn't a good way for me to categorize or tell you guys how the armor is applied to each thrall or each faction, and that information is not on the wiki and it's not on the spreadsheet that I'm linking. However, the easiest way to figure out how much armor you're getting per point in grit is to just divide the amount of natural armor on the stats page by the amount of points that thrall has in grit, and that'll tell you how many points they're gaining every time they level up in grit. And you could do the same with the vitality and the hit points. You look at the bonus hit points gained and divide it by the number of vitality points that Thrall currently has. And that'll tell you how many hit points they're gaining per point leveled in vitality. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about here is the growth chance percentages that you see on the right hand side of the attributes page. Those growth chance percentages are randomly generated when you place the thrall. So sometimes you'll have a really good growth chance in something that you want, and sometimes you won't. The only way to get a different growth chance there is to capture that thrall again and hope that you get a better growth chance roll when you place that thrall. Now, the last thing that you guys might have questions about is the perks. And I'm not going to get into perks in this video because some of it's random, some of it's not, and it really deserves its own video to explain it properly. However, what I will say is that if you're going to use an Elixir of Rebirth, you shouldn't use that if you have the Jack of all Trades perk, because you cannot receive the Jack of all Trades perk after you level your thrall past level 10. But really, you should be waiting until level 20 to re-roll those perks, because a lot of those high level vitality perks are available after level 20. So my recommendation is get to level 20 and then re-roll until you have the perks that you want on your thrall. Don't forget to whack the like button on the way out, and let me know in the comment section below what you learned from this video. I'd like to thank all my YouTube members for your continued support. Y'all are absolute legends. If you'd like to become a legend, there's a button that says join on this page. Click that for details. There's 2 videos on the screen. Click one of those to watch next, and I'll meet you over there.